So as a lot of you probably know, I'm really obsessed with making favorites lists. I love trying to figure out what are my favorite shows, how do they compare with one another, and structuring them all into some kind of hierarchy. And the biggest difficulty that I find myself having when I do this is in figuring out which counts for more. The experience of watching a show or the experience of thinking about the show afterwards. Because both of them are very valuable, and it can be really weird to look at like how I've scored certain shows based on like what I'm thinking of them now as opposed to what I thought when I finished the series. I think there's a certain physicality that happens when you're watching a show where like enjoying it in the moment like makes you physically feel great. And I think that the reason that so many people when they watch something are so quick to give it like a 10 out of 10 instantly, to be like, "Oh my god, that was the best thing I've ever seen. 10 10 10 10 10. Everybody watch this." Is because they're coming off of that high, that literal endorphin rush that comes from seeing something really cool and memorable. But then over time, there's certain shows that maybe you find yourself thinking about all the time, and it might not necessarily correlate with that kind of rush. And sometimes there's even shows, and this is usually the problem I run into, is shows that maybe hadn't been that entertaining but kept me interested over a long period of time. And those are the ones that I find the hardest to judge. For a perfect example of that from this year, I want to talk about Tonkatsu DJ Agetaro. This was a very simplistic show, a very fun little short series of 12 episodes that are 7 minutes long. And I talked about it in a vlog around the time that I finished it. And this show I just sort of comfortably gave a 7. I considered it like a strong 6 to a light 7 kind of show. It had some really fun ideas, some fun characters and scenes, but a lot of it is pretty silly. There's times where I didn't really care that much about what was going on. Even in such a short runtime, not every episode felt totally necessary or like it was, making all this great progress towards an eventual goal. And so, like, the experience of watching the show was more like a yeah kind of thing. It wasn't really this, like, big deal. So, in comparison to some other shows that I had already loved for a long time, that were already slated above it, I really have to think that it wasn't as good. Like, let's say something like Akagami no Shirayuki Hime. That's a show that's pretty pleasant to watch, and it's got really beautiful artwork and great, animation and characters and stuff like that, and it's a pretty good show. And I'd rate that above Tonkatsu DJ Agataro in terms of, like, the watching experience of it. However, over time, I find myself thinking about Tonkatsu DJ all the time because just the premise of it was so memorable, and the visuals were so distinct and unique, and the music was so distinct. And I have had the soundtrack on my computer for a while because I'm using it in a project that I'm putting together. And just because I happened to have those files laying around, and that music is so good for like using as backgrounds in videos, then that's been like my go-to for vlogs like for a while now. Like a lot of people have pointed out that I've been using that soundtrack like crazy in a lot of my vlogs. So yeah, like it stays in my mind because I really appreciate like the attitude and the uniqueness of the series and the idea of the series, and I think about it a lot. But then when I look at it in my listing, in my my rankings and stuff, and I see it compared to like Shirayuki Hime, which is the kind of show that after I finish watching it, I barely remember anything that happened. By the time I watched season 2 of Shirayuki Hime, I like really was playing catch up with who all the characters were and what they'd been doing. I could vaguely remember parts of season 1. I still don't remember a lot of what happened. And season 2 already, it feels vague to me, compared to Tonkatsu where everything kind of stood out. And balancing those things is odd because I don't know which one I value more. I have had times where I increased my score for a show because of the fact that I kept thinking about it all the time and enjoying it more and more in my head, and then I went and watched it again and remembered why I haven't given it a higher score. I've had like episodes where I'm just completely bored and I'm like, oh, right, this show, this show on a baseline level isn't maybe the most exciting, whereas there's some shows that you could return to again and again and again, and it always gets like more hype and more interesting the more you look at it. A show that I kind of grapple with my score of is Neon Genesis Evangelion, because like I really think the first 9 episodes of that are like a joy to watch because they're so tightly directed and animated, and just every shot is communicating something, and the writing's fucking tight, and it has all this cool show don't tell kind of storytelling. And then you get to the second half of the show and there's a lot more of like just kind of beating you over the head with the point a little bit. There's a lot more of these scenes where like an animation repeats on a cycle for 2 minutes while someone says some disjointed shit, you know, and those things aren't as enjoyable to watch for me, although other scenes are incredible to watch. And like, so as I go through the later half of that show, I have to think like, well, okay, all the ideas in the second half are the most interesting ideas. Like, the reason those first 9 episodes are so great is because you're thinking about the stuff that you saw in the second half of the series. Like, you know, if you go back and watch it again, those episodes are greatly enhanced by knowing what they mean in the context of what this show is trying to say. Whereas the second half is less enjoyable to watch because you already know all this stuff, and so you just kind of can see the seams in how it was presented. So like, that's where I come to this quandary where it's like, okay, I think about Ava all the time. Like, I really do, you know, it comes up in conversation a lot. It's the kind of show that, like, each character has, like, imprinted itself in my mind in a way. And, like, when I compare that to some other shows that, like, even one of the shows in my top 10 that I've had as my number 2 for a very long time is the film Ponyo, which, as I said in my last video, like, I don't really have any intellectual feelings towards the movie at all. I don't think about it very much. There's not like a lot of times where I suddenly am thinking about Ponyo. You know, at best I might make references to some of the dialogue from the movie, but watching the film is so enjoyable. Like, just sitting down and having it on is like the most euphoric kind of feeling. So which one's worth more? Because if you think about it in like terms of affecting me on a day-to-day basis, like the fact that I think about Ava so much means that it's like giving me more overall than the actual experience of watching it is giving me. Whereas Ponyo is maybe not giving me as much. But then again, if watching it, like, you know, like, which one would I rather just throw on right now, you know? I mean, I would certainly be down to watch some Ava if someone suggested it, but if someone was like, let's watch Ponyo, I'd be fucking ecstatic, you know? I'd be getting the snacks ready and being like, let's watch it twice, why not? So it really is difficult for me, and I think it's an interesting sort of thought that doesn't come up a lot in like reviewing shows or talking about shows, because most people talk about them right after watching them. You know, there's not nearly as much conversation that happens about shows as time goes on, even though personally I think a lot of those are the more interesting conversations to have, the ones once the series has sunk in and you've really had time to think about it and marinate on it, you know. And like, yeah, I think I kind of wish, and I've said this a number of times before, because like, I hate the whole seasonal anime thing. I hate watching stuff while it's airing. I'd rather watch it once it's already made its mark, and then like we can really understand its place in culture and have more context for it, and then we can think about it for a long time and really present it in all its glory, you know. And I think a show like maybe Kill La Kill, where people were still hashing out like what the show was really about for over a year after it aired, and like the conversation that could be had about it was by far at its most interesting in 2015 as opposed to in 2014 when the conversation was about fan service or something and who gives a fuck, you know. Like, there's so many more interesting ideas that could have been explored, but no one's gonna do it because the show's not relevant anymore, you know. And that's why I think this becomes such a conundrum, and why I feel like a lot of people give a show a score and they don't think about it ever again, you know, or they don't for years. As soon as the show is over, they immediately tack that score on, and then they keep it that way. And there's not a lot of reflecting. There's not a lot of looking back and like comparing those scores to the new ones you've given, you know. Like, I spend a lot of time on my Mal list, like with all the scores, just like, you know, I'll put a new show on and then I have to like face the other shows, because that's the way that list works, is that it's a list of every single show in order, and for me to put a new show on the list, I have to literally like think, well, was this as good as Konosuba? Was it better than Prison School or worse? Where does it fit into this? You know, did I laugh more at this one? Is it more enjoyable? Do I think about it more? You know, and then like try to fit it in there, and then even then over time I have the shows that you know, I really enjoyed Yamada-kun and the Seven Witches when I watched it. I probably gave that like an 8 or an 8.25 or something, but I don't think about it that much. Whereas Konosuba, I actually think about a lot. You know, there was a lot of episodes which I probably gave the same score, but like there's a lot of episodes of the show that weren't as funny, and so when I think back on the show, I think, well, I know that I didn't love every episode, but at the same time, really love those characters, and I really think about that world and that setting a lot, so maybe it deserves a higher score than Yamada-kun and the Seven Witches. And this kind of shit is constantly happening in my head, and like I don't think, I try to like put it out of mind to some extent, because I don't want to be constantly revising my fucking favorites list every 10 days or whatever that I change my mind about something. But you know, it can be quite the conundrum, and I kind of wish more people thought about it this way, and that like we could, you know, continue to talk about these shows and how good they were later down the line, as opposed to just when the season's over.